Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Story Time with Mr. Hallum. You know what day it is? Beep, 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 beep. That's right. It's Chris Van Allsburg Wednesday. Whoop, 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 whoop. Now, I know you're not as excited about this as I am. I like Chris Van Allsburg. He's one of my favorites. But this week is what's today's date? 15th, 16th. I've lost track of my days. And next week will be the week going into Christmas. Next week, we'll have 5 days of stories. That's right. I'm telling you right now, 5 days of stories. I'm going to do Christmas stories every day. And Chris Van Allsburg Wednesday will be moved to Chris Van Allsburg Christmas Day. And I'm going to read his famous Christmas story on Christmas Day. So that's all I'm going to say. But you have something to look forward to. Today, I'm reading one of my favorite stories. It's called A Bad Day at Riverbend. Okay? By the way, there's Chris Van Allsburg. Child. Chris Van Allsburg. Mustachioed. This book is from... what year was this book written? $1995. That's right. This book's been around a while. All right? Bad Day at Riverbend. Riverbend was a quiet little town. Just a couple dozen buildings alongside a dusty road that led nowhere. Though the stagecoach occasionally rolled through town, it never stopped because no one ever came to Riverbend and no one ever left. It was the kind of place where one day was just like all the rest. But one morning, Sheriff Ned Hardy stood in front of the Riverbend jail and saw something he'd never seen before. A brilliant light in the western sky. It lasted a few minutes, then faded away. Sheriff Hardy went into the jailhouse. He was sitting quietly at his desk, wondering what the strange light meant, when a loud pounding rattled the jailhouse door. The sheriff opened it and saw Owen Buck, the blacksmith's boy, breathing so hard he could barely speak. In between gasps, Ned Hardy heard the words, "Stagecoach," and "Something awful." The sheriff followed Owen outside. The coach had never stopped in Riverbend before, but now it stood motionless at the end of the street. A crowd gathered around it, but they held back as if they were afraid to go too close. It was easy to see why. The horses were covered with great stripes of some kind of shiny, greasy slime. "What is it, Sheriff?" someone asked as Ned Hardy stepped up to the coach. He didn't know. It was the strangest thing he'd ever seen. The strangest thing anyone had ever seen. The horses were nervous and breathing hard. They looked terrible, their smooth white coats scarred with the strange stuff that hung from them in loopy ropes. or stuck out like stiff wire. The sheriff grabbed a piece with both hands. It was slippery. He gave it a pull, and the horse jerked away and whimpered in pain. Whatever it was, it stuck to them as sure as their flesh. "Where's the coachman?" Sheriff Hardy asked. "Gone," someone answered. "The coach came into town without him." So what do you think it is on the horse? Greasy, loopy. Ned Hardy wasn't sure what to do. He scratched his head. "Well," he finally said, "guess I'll go look for him." The sheriff rode out of town, following the wagon's trail west. Before long he stopped. The ground was covered with the same marks that were on the horses. Whatever happened must have happened here. He didn't see any sign of the driver, but he heard a muffled sound. Ned Hardy got off of his horse and discovered the coachman sitting on the ground behind a rock. The poor man looked awful. He was covered with the greasy slime. Thick stripes of the stuff ran right across his eyes and mouth. He couldn't see or speak except to mumble. The sheriff helped the coachman up and led him to the horse. As they rode together back toward Riverbend, Ned Hardy heard the sound of thundering hoofbeats. He rode to the top of the ridge and looked down on a charging herd of cattle, many marked with the same awful slime that covered his poor saddle-mate. When he turned his horse back towards town, he saw the same bright light in the sky he'd seen earlier that morning. It was just beyond the horizon, right over Riverbend. It didn't last long. As he approached Riverbend, it was clear to Ned Hardy, even from a distance, that something terrible had happened. Riding into town, he could barely bring himself to look at the buildings, now covered with the hideous marks and stripes. The sheriff got out of the saddle. The town looked deserted, but when he passed the hotel, someone called out, "Sheriff!" Ned Hardy helped the coach driver down and led him to the hotel. The townspeople and some cowboys were gathered inside. A few were covered with the greasy slime. They all told the same story. Without warning, the sky overhead had filled with a brilliant light, a light that froze everything it touched, herds of cattle, even birds in the sky, and it was blinding. "Like stepping out of the privy and looking straight into the sun at high noon," one of the cowboys said. "Couldn't see a darn thing." When the light passed, they were covered with the greasy marks. "What are we going to do, Sheriff?" someone asked. "We can't spend our lives hiding in here." "No," Ned Hardy said. "No, we can't." He walked outside and stood in front of the hotel. His bravery inspired the others, and they joined him there. They looked at their poor town. Pretty little Riverbend was now too ugly for words. "Look!" someone shouted, pointing at the sky above the hills just out of town. The mysterious light appeared. Some people ran back into the hotel, but Ned Hardy just stared at the strange light without blinking an eye. "Whatever evil thing has done this out in those hills," he said, pointing in the direction of the light, "I aim to ride out there and put an end to it." The sheriff led the town with a posse of well-armed men. They followed the trail of light. It wasn't hard to tell where it had been. The greasy streaks were everywhere. The men even saw them floating in the sky, but the light they sought always appeared just beyond the horizon. Ned Hardy was sure that this long... Sorry, missed a page. Then they saw the mysterious light shine brightly just over the next hill. The men crawled up the hill, but the light faded away as they peeked over the top. Looking down, the brave cowboys saw something that made them gasp. There was a man standing perfectly still at the bottom of the hill. He was as tall as a cottonwood tree and as skinny as a broomstick, and he looked like he was made entirely of the greasy stuff that now covered the countryside. Kind of a scary-looking guy. Ned Hardy was sure this long-legged fellow was the cause of all the grief. They had only one chance. They'd have to get close enough to take a shot at this skinny devil before he used the light to freeze them. They crawled back to their horses. Ned Hardy gave a silent signal, and the posse charged forward. But just as they came over the hill, they were frozen in the bright light that suddenly filled the sky. And then the light went out. They were in a coloring book. That's cool. Have you ever thought about what it would be like if you lived in a coloring book? Suddenly that greasy stuff's all over the place. What is that greasy stuff? Crayon. I know. Not the stuff in my hair. That's expensive. All right. So that was today's Chris Van Allsburg Wednesday. Whoop, whoop. And we'll get back together tomorrow for another story. But until then, what kind of coloring book would you like to live in? Think about that. And while you think about that, remember, come back tomorrow for more story time with Mr. Hallum.